The morning sun peeked through the windows of Atlanta International Airport as Captain James Reeves walked through the terminal, his pilot's cap tucked under his arm and his uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 45, he had the kind of face that showed experience, not just from his 15 years flying commercial jets, but from the life he'd lived before that. A life few people on his flights ever knew about. "Morning, Captain," called out Pete, the gate agent who'd been working this route for nearly a decade. "Looking like a full flight to San Francisco today." James nodded, offering a small smile. "Weather report." "Clear skies most of the way. Maybe some turbulence over the Rockies, but nothing you haven't handled 100 times before." James checked his watch, a simple, sturdy timepiece that had seen him through 3 war zones before he ever entered a commercial cockpit. He still had time for his pre-flight routine. A cup of black coffee and 15 minutes to review the flight plan in peaceful silence. That peace was broken by loud voices from the boarding area. James glanced over and noticed a group of men in leather vests laughing too loudly for 7 a.m. The vests caught his attention, black leather with a red emblem showing a grinning skull surrounded by flames. Below it, the words "Steel Demons" were stitched in bold letters. His jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "They're on your flight," Pete said quietly, following James's gaze. 6 of them. They've been drinking since they got here." "Any trouble?" James asked. "Not yet, but they're making the other passengers nervous. I've already had 3 people ask to be seated away from them." James nodded. "I'll keep an eye on things." In the cockpit, James went through his pre-flight checks with his co-pilot, Tom Chen. Tom was young, just 32, with the enthusiasm of someone who still found flying magical. "Did you see those bikers in the terminal?" Tom asked as they reviewed the fuel levels. "Hardcore-looking bunch." "I noticed," James said simply. The boarding process went smoothly until the final group was called. The bikers pushed their way to the front of the line, ignoring the frustrated sighs from other passengers. James watched from the cockpit doorway as they made their way down the aisle, taking up more space than necessary, bumping seats and laughing when passengers had to move for them. Flight attendant Lisa Jones, who'd been flying with James for almost 5 years, approached the cockpit with a tight smile. "Those bikers insisted on sitting together. They wouldn't take their assigned seats, so I had to ask a family to split up." "Any major issues?" James asked. "Not yet, but they've clearly been drinking, and one of them tried to bring their own liquor on board. I confiscated it, but..." She didn't finish her sentence, but the worry in her eyes was clear. James nodded. "Keep me updated. If anything happens, let me know immediately." As the plane prepared for takeoff, James made his welcome announcement, his voice calm and reassuring as always. But there was something different in his tone when he mentioned that all passengers are expected to follow crew instructions for everyone's safety. His subtle emphasis that most passengers wouldn't notice, but in the middle of the plane, the leader of the bikers, a tall man with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos, looked up at the speaker with narrowed eyes. The plane pushed back from the gate, and James focused on the familiar routine of takeoff. But part of his mind remained aware of the potential trouble brewing in the cabin. Few people knew that before becoming a pilot, James had spent 12 years in the Marines, with the last 5 in Force Recon, the Marines' Special Operations Unit. He'd handled far worse than a group of rowdy bikers. 3 hours into the flight, Lisa's voice came through on the intercom. "Captain, could you come to the cabin when you have a moment? We'd have a situation." James exchanged a look with Tom. "Take the controls," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Whatever was happening back there, James Reeves was about to show everyone on board that he was far more than just a pilot. James made his way down the narrow aisle of the plane, nodding reassuringly to concerned passengers. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to touch. 3 hours into the flight, the situation had clearly gotten out of hand. He could hear the bikers before he saw them, loud laughter and cursing that cut through the usual drone of the engines. As he approached the middle section, he saw Lisa trying to reason with the largest of the men, her professional smile strained to its breaking point. "Sir, I've asked you 3 times to keep your voice down and put your seatbelt on," she was saying. The biker, a mountain of a man with a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, smirked at her. "And I told you I don't take orders from flight attendants, sweetheart." His friends laughed, clinking their plastic cups together. Empty mini bottles of whiskey littered their tray tables, far more than should have been served to any passenger group. "Is there a problem here?" James asked, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made several of the bikers look up. Lisa turned to him with relief in her eyes. "Captain, these gentlemen have ignored multiple requests to follow safety protocols. They've been drinking their own alcohol, which they somehow smuggled on board, and they've been making inappropriate comments to female passengers." The bearded biker stood up, towering over Lisa. He was tall enough that his head nearly touched the overhead bins. "We paid for these seats just like everybody else. We're just having a good time." James noticed an elderly woman across the aisle leaning as far away from the group as possible. A young mother 2 rows ahead was covering her child's ears. "Sir, I need you to sit down and buckle up," James said, meeting the man's eyes without flinching. "And I need all of you to lower your voices and stop the disruptive behavior." Another biker, this one with a shaved head and a scar running through his right eyebrow, laughed. "Or what, pilot man? You gonna turn the plane around?" The tension in the cabin ratcheted up another notch. A businessman in a suit halfway up the aisle muttered, "Someone should do something about those guys." The biker with the beard heard him and turned. "You got something to say?" The businessman looked away quickly. "That's what I thought," the biker sneered, then turned back to James. "Look, Captain, we're just—" He stopped mid-sentence as a bout of turbulence shook the plane. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, and the plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. "Everyone needs to be seated now," James said firmly. "We're hitting some rough air." The turbulence worsened, and the bearded biker stumbled, grabbing the seat in front of him to stay upright. The plane lurched again, and he nearly fell into the lap of another passenger. "Sit down, Hawk," the biker with the scar said. He seemed less drunk than his friend, and something in his eyes as he looked at James suggested he recognized the potential danger of the situation. "All of you need to be seated and buckled in immediately," James said, his voice carrying over the anxious murmurs filling the cabin. "This isn't a request." The plane shuddered again, and Hawk finally dropped into his seat, though he didn't buckle up. James turned to go back to the cockpit when he heard a cry of pain. Lisa had been making her way up the aisle when the turbulence hit hard. She stumbled and reached out to steady herself, accidentally grabbing the shoulder of one of the younger bikers. The man reacted by shoving her away, sending her sprawling into the lap of an elderly passenger. "Keep your hands off me," the young biker spat. That was enough. James helped Lisa to her feet, checking that she was okay before turning back to the bikers. Something had changed in his demeanor, a subtle shift that the more observant passengers noticed immediately. His posture straightened, his eyes hardened, and the quiet authority of a commercial pilot was replaced by something else entirely. "What's your name?" James asked the biker who had pushed Lisa. The young man seemed taken aback by the direct question. They call me Wrench." "Well, Wrench," James said, his voice deadly calm. "You and your friends have 2 choices right now. You can sit down, buckle up, and behave for the remainder of this flight, or what?" Hawk challenged, but there was less conviction in his voice now. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at the scared biker, who seemed to be the leader of the group. "I need to speak with you privately. Now." The scared man held James's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine." As they moved toward the front of the plane, passengers watched in tense silence, wondering what the calm pilot had in mind for the bikers who had harassed everyone for the past 3 hours. James led the scared biker to the small galley area near the front of the plane. Flight attendants stepped aside, their eyes following the pair with a mix of concern and curiosity. Once they had as much privacy as possible on a crowded airplane, James turned to face the biker. "What's your name?" James asked, his voice level. The biker hesitated, then answered, "They call me Razor." "Well, Razor, I'm going to be straight with you. Your group is endangering this flight. I've got 2 choices. Have air marshals meet us when we land or handle this now between us." Razor crossed his arms. "Look, we're just having some fun. People are too uptight these days." "Fun?" James said. "Your friend put hands on my flight attendant. Another one of you has been making comments to a teenage girl 3 rows back." You've all been drinking smuggled alcohol, which is a federal offense. This isn't about being uptight. This is about safety and respect." Something in James's calm intensity made Razor study him more carefully. "You don't seem like most pilots I've met," he said finally. James held his gaze. "There's a reason for that." Without breaking eye contact, James rolled up his right sleeve just enough to reveal a tattoo, a globe and anchor, the Marine Corps emblem, with a number beneath it that meant nothing to most civilians, but clearly registered with Razor. "You Force Recon?" Razor asked, his voice dropping. James nodded once. 12 years in the Corps, 5 in Special Operations. Razor's posture changed subtly. "I was Army, 10th Mountain Division, Afghanistan 2009 to 2011. "Then you understand chain of command," James said. "And right now, on this aircraft, that chain ends with me." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and both men automatically widened their stance to keep balance, a soldier's instinct that never quite disappeared. "I need your word that you and your friends will behave for the rest of this flight," James continued. "Or I radio ahead, and you're all dealing with federal charges when we land." Razor uncrossed his arms. "Hawk's been through a lot. Lost his brother last month. This trip was supposed to help him blow off steam." "I understand grief," James said, his eyes softening slightly, "but not at the expense of everyone else's safety." A moment of silence stretched between them, a silent assessment that military men recognized. "Here's what's going to happen," James said finally. "You're going to go back there and get your friends in line." Everyone sits down, buckles up, and keeps their voices at a reasonable level. No more alcohol, no more harassment. In return, I don't radio ahead about what's already happened. "And if I can't control them?" Razor asked. "Then I'll have to," James replied simply. "And neither of us wants that." Something in his tone made Razor nod slowly. "All right, Captain, you've got my word, but Hawk isn't going to like it." "I'm not asking him to like it. I'm telling him how it's going to be." Razor's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You remind me of my old CO. Tough but fair." "Highest compliment a Marine can get from Army," James said, allowing a small smile of his own. They walked back through the cabin together. Passengers watched nervously, wondering what had been said. The other bikers straightened up as they approached, sensing a shift in their leader's attitude. "Listen up," Razor said to his friends, his voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Captain here and I have come to an understanding. We're going to cool it for the rest of the flight." "You serious?" Hawk growled. "We're just—" "I said cool it," Razor cut him off. "That's an order." The military phrasing wasn't lost on the other bikers. They exchanged looks, clearly surprised by their leader's change in tone. "Captain," Lisa approached cautiously. "Is everything all right?" "It will be," James replied. He turned to address the bikers one last time. "I'll be checking in regularly. Don't make me regret giving you this chance." As James headed back to the cockpit, passengers started whispering to each other. No one could quite believe what they'd just witnessed. A pilot somehow diffusing a situation that had seemed ready to explode just minutes before. "What did you say to him?" Tom asked when James returned to the flight deck. James buckled his seatbelt and checked the instruments before answering. Just spoke a language he could understand. Little did anyone know, the real test of their unexpected truce was about to come. The next hour passed without incident. The bikers kept to themselves, their voices low, their behavior in check. Passengers gradually relaxed, though many still cast nervous glances toward the middle of the plane. Lisa and the other flight attendants resumed their duties, the tension in their shoulders easing somewhat. In the cockpit, James and Tom monitored their flight path. The weather radar showed a massive storm system ahead. "Looks like we'll need to change course," Tom said. "That's a big one." James nodded, already calculating the best route. "Let's request permission to divert north. Should add about 20 minutes to our flight time." As Tom radioed air traffic control, James glanced at the cabin display monitor. The bikers were quiet, most of them appearing to doze. All except Razor, who sat alert, occasionally checking on his friends. "Captain, we've got authorization to adjust course," Tom reported. "But they're warning about severe turbulence even on the new route. This system is larger than expected." James reached for the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're approaching some severe weather and will be changing our course to avoid the worst of it. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for turbulence. The first jolt hit just as Lisa was making her final check. The plane dropped suddenly, causing her to grab a headrest to stay upright. Oxygen masks dropped in 2 sections, dangling from the ceiling like yellow snakes. A chorus of gasps and cries filled the cabin. Everyone stay calm, Lisa called out. This is just turbulence. Please secure your masks if they've dropped. Another violent shake sent a carry-on bag tumbling from an overhead bin, narrowly missing an elderly man's head. The plane seemed to drop again, this time more severely, tilting to one side. In the cockpit, James fought to stabilize the aircraft while Tom monitored the systems. That can't be right, Tom muttered, frowning at one of the gauges. What is it? James asked, his hands steady on the controls. Cabin pressures fluctuating. Could be a sensor malfunction, but... A sharp ping interrupted him as a warning light flashed on the console. Possible breach in the cargo hold, Tom said, his voice tight. Small, but it's affecting pressure. James made an immediate decision. Start emergency procedures. I'll address the passengers. The plane rocked again as James hit the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties in addition to the turbulence. There's no immediate danger, but as a precaution, I'm asking all passengers to prepare for emergency protocols. Flight attendants will provide instructions. In the main cabin, the fear was palpable. A young woman began to cry. An older man loudly demanded answers. Children clung to their parents. Lisa struggled to maintain order. Everyone, please listen carefully. A loud popping sound cut her off as another section of oxygen masks dropped, causing more panic. The cabin lights flickered, then dimmed to emergency mode. We're all gonna die, someone shouted. I knew we shouldn't have flown today, another voice added. The panic was spreading like wildfire. Then, unexpectedly, a deep voice cut through the chaos. Evie, why you go de shut epa? Hawk bellowed, standing in the aisle. The cabin fell silent in shock. Listen to the flight attendants, Hawk continued. Panicking won't help anybody. Razor stood too. You heard him. Everyone calm down and follow instructions. The other bikers joined them, forming a line down the center aisle. What do you need us to do? Razor asked Lisa. For a moment, she stared at him in disbelief. Then her training kicked in. Help get oxygen masks secured on the elderly passengers and children first. Keep people in their seats. The bikers nodded and spread out through the cabin. The youngest one, Wrench, who had pushed Lisa earlier, now gently helped an old woman with her mask, murmuring reassurances. Pressure's still dropping, Tom reported in the cockpit. We need to descend to a safer altitude. James nodded, already beginning the maneuver. Through the cabin monitor, he caught glimpses of the bikers helping flight attendants keep order. His gamble on Razor had paid off in a way he never could have anticipated. The plane continued to shake violently as it descended through the storm clouds. But now, instead of chaos inside the cabin, there was unexpected cooperation, led by the very men who had caused so much trouble earlier. And this was just the beginning of the strangest flight James Reeves had ever captained. James managed to bring the plane down to a safer altitude where the turbulence eased slightly. The oxygen masks were no longer necessary, but the tension in the cabin remained high. Through it all, the bikers continued to help the flight attendants maintain order. Pressure's stabilizing, Tom reported from the co-pilot's seat. But we've still got that warning light for the cargo hold. James nodded, his face grim. We need to land as soon as possible. What's the nearest airport that can handle us? Tom consulted the navigation system. Denver. We can be there in about 40 minutes. Make the call, James said. Tell them we need emergency landing clearance. As Tom contacted Denver International Airport, James switched to the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've stabilized at a lower altitude where the air is calmer. As a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Denver in approximately 40 minutes. Please continue to follow all instructions from the flight crew. In the main cabin, Lisa approached Razor. Thank you, she said quietly, for helping. Razor shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Seemed like the right thing to do. Before she could respond, a cry of pain came from the back of the plane. An elderly man was clutching his chest, his face contorted in agony. "We need help here," his wife called out, her voice thin with fear. Lisa rushed toward them, with Razor following close behind. The old man was gasping for breath, his skin turning an alarming shade of gray. "Does anyone on board have medical training?" Lisa called out. Passengers looked around helplessly. "I do," said a voice from behind them. It was one of the bikers, a quieter man with a thick beard and glasses who had barely spoken during the earlier commotion. "I was a combat medic in Iraq, 2 tours." The biker, who the others called Doc, knelt beside the elderly man. "Sir, can you tell me what you're feeling?" "Chest tight," the man wheezed. "Can't breathe." Doc looked up at Lisa. "Possible heart attack. Do you have a medical kit? Any aspirin on board?" Lisa nodded and rushed to get the plane's emergency medical supplies. Doc loosened the man's collar and belt, speaking calmly to him the entire time. "What's your name, sir?" "Frank," the man gasped. "Okay, Frank, I'm going to help you. Just try to stay calm and breathe slowly if you can." Frank's wife clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Please help him. We're flying to see our new grandbaby. Our first." Doc nodded, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "We'll get him there, ma'am." Lisa returned with the medical kit. Doc immediately opened it, found the aspirin, and gave one to Frank. "Chew this, don't swallow it whole." He then took out the small oxygen bottle and mask from the kit and placed it over Frank's face. "This will help you breathe easier." In the cockpit, James received updates from both Tom and the cabin crew. "Medical emergency in addition to our technical issues," James said, his voice tight. "Tell Denver we'll need medical personnel standing by." "Already done," Tom assured him. "They'll be waiting for us." James checked the cabin monitor again. The scene had completely transformed from a few hours ago. The bikers who had been causing so much trouble were now spread throughout the cabin, helping wherever needed. Hawk was calming a frightened child by showing him how to make paper airplanes from a flight safety card. Wrench was helping an elderly woman secure her belongings for the emergency landing. And Doc was still tending to Frank, monitoring his breathing and pulse with professional focus. "Never would have called this one," Tom murmured, following James's gaze. "People can surprise you," James replied, "for better or worse." The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, less severe than before but enough to remind everyone of their precarious situation. In the distance, lightning flashed through the storm clouds they'd managed to skirt. 25 minutes to Denver," Tom announced. James nodded, his hands steady on the controls. "Let's hope that's quick enough." For Frank, for the damaged plane, and for the 134 souls on board, the next 25 minutes would be the longest of their lives. The flight toward Denver continued through patches of turbulence. In the back of the plane, Doc remained beside Frank, monitoring his condition. Frank's breathing had improved slightly with the oxygen, but his color was still poor, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. "How's he doing?" Razor asked, bringing a bottle of water that Frank's wife had requested. Doc shook his head slightly. "Not great. He needs a hospital soon." Frank's wife, Beth, held her husband's hand tightly. "We've been married for 47 years, she told Doc, her voice trembling. "He insisted on taking this flight even though he hasn't been feeling well lately. Said nothing would keep him from meeting little Joey." "Joey's your grandson?" Doc asked, trying to keep her calm. Beth nodded, wiping tears with her free hand. "First grandchild. Our daughter Emmy tried for years to have a baby. This was supposed to be the happiest trip of our lives." Razor put a gentle hand on Beth's shoulder. "And it still will be, ma'am. We're going to get Frank to that hospital, and he'll see little Joey soon." In the cockpit, James was in constant communication with Denver Air Traffic Control. The turbulence was making the approach more difficult than usual, and the warning light for the cargo hold continued to blink ominously. "How's our passenger doing?" James asked Tom, who had just received an update from Lisa. "Hanging in there, but still critical," Tom replied. "The biker with medical training is doing everything he can, but—" James nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. "Tell Denver we need that ambulance as close to the aircraft as possible after landing. Every minute counts." As they began their final approach, James got on the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver. Please make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. We may experience some turbulence during landing, so please stay in your seats until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. Medical personnel will board as soon as we land to assist our passenger in need." Back in the cabin, Doc was facing a difficult decision. Frank's condition was deteriorating rapidly. "His pulse is getting weaker," Doc told Lisa quietly. "He might not make it until we land." "What can we do?" she asked. Doc ran a hand through his beard, thinking, "I need more space to work on him. And I need help." Lisa looked around the crowded plane. "The crew rest area might work. It's small, but at least he could lie flat." "Let's move him," Doc decided. "Razor, Hawk, I need your help." The two bikers immediately stepped forward. With care, they lifted Frank from his seat and carried him to the crew rest area, a small space where flight attendants could take breaks on long flights. They laid him gently on the narrow bunk. "Wrench," Doc called. "Get my bag from under my seat." The younger biker hurried off and returned with a worn leather backpack. Doc opened it and pulled out a small kit that looked nothing like a standard first aid set. "You carry that with you?" Lisa asked, surprised. "Old habits," Doc replied simply. "Never know when someone might need help." From the kit, he took out a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, and several items that Lisa couldn't identify. "Is that even allowed on planes?" she asked. "Probably not," Doc admitted, "but right now it might save Frank's life." The plane hit a rough patch of air, jolting everyone. From the cockpit, they heard James's voice. "Final approach. Landing in 5 minutes." Doc looked up at Beth, who had followed them to the crew area. "Mrs. Frank's going to need a procedure that can't wait until we land. I've done this in much worse conditions, but I need your permission." Beth looked terrified but nodded. "Do whatever you have to. Just save him." "I'll need space," Doc told the others. "Razor, stay with me. Everyone else, give us room." As the others stepped back, Doc leaned close to Razor and spoke quietly. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," Razor said firmly. "You've got this, Doc, just like that time outside Fallujah." Doc took a deep breath and unwrapped a syringe from his kit. His hands, which had been rock steady throughout the crisis, now held the fate of a stranger's life as the plane began its final descent toward Denver. Outside the small crew area, passengers held their breath, praying for two miracles: a safe landing for their troubled aircraft and a chance at life for Frank. The wheels of the plane touched down on the Denver runway with a screech. Despite the turbulence, James executed a perfect landing, bringing the aircraft to a stop faster than usual but with remarkable smoothness given the circumstances. "Medical team is standing by," the control tower confirmed through his headset. "Roger that," James replied. "We have a passenger in critical condition. Tell them to board immediately." In the small crew rest area, Doc had performed what he later described as the most basic version of an emergency procedure to help Frank's heart. With Razor's assistance, he'd managed to stabilize the older man, at least temporarily. "Hang in there, buddy," Doc said, checking Frank's pulse again. "Help's almost here." Beth squeezed her husband's hand. "Frank, we're on the ground. You're going to be okay. You still need to meet Joey, remember?" As if he heard her, Frank's eyelids fluttered. The plane had barely come to a complete stop when emergency personnel boarded through the front door. James left the cockpit to direct them to the crew rest area, where they quickly took over Frank's care. "What did you do?" one paramedic asked Doc, noting the equipment. "What I had to," Doc replied. "He was going into cardiac arrest. I gave him—" "He saved my husband's life," Beth interrupted, her voice firm despite her tears. "That's what matters." The paramedics efficiently transferred Frank to a stretcher. As they prepared to move him off the plane, Beth turned to Doc and the other bikers. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "if you hadn't been here." "Go with your husband, ma'am," Razor said gently. "That's thanks enough." As the medical team rushed Frank off the plane, the remaining passengers sat in stunned silence. The story of what had happened in the crew rest area had spread throughout the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced over the intercom, "we'll be remaining here in Denver for at least 2 hours while maintenance crews check the aircraft. You're welcome to deplane and wait in the terminal." Those continuing to San Francisco will be updated about our departure time. As passengers began to gather their belongings, many stopped to thank the bikers. The same people who had been frightened of them hours earlier now patted their shoulders, shook their hands, and even hugged them. "Never thought I'd be hugging a guy called Hawk," laughed the elderly woman he had helped. "Just glad everyone's okay," Hawk replied, looking surprisingly shy. Liza approached the group. "The captain would like to speak with you all before you leave the aircraft." The bikers exchanged glances, perhaps wondering if they were in trouble after all. They made their way to the front of the plane, where James stood waiting. "That was some quick thinking back there," James said to Doc. "Not many people would have had the courage to do what you did." Doc shrugged. "Just used my training." "Like you did, landing this bird so smoothly in that weather." James looked at the group of bikers, Razor, Hawk, Doc, Wrench, and the two others. 6 men who had boarded his plane as troublemakers and were leaving as heroes. "I misjudged you," James admitted, "and I'm not too proud to say it." "We didn't exactly make a great first impression," Razor said with a wry smile. "And we owe your flight attendant an apology." He looked at Lisa. "I'm sorry for how we behaved. No excuses." Lisa nodded, accepting the apology. "So what happens now?" Hawk asked. "We still facing charges when we land in San Francisco." James shook his head. "Not from me." "I'd say your actions today more than made up for a few disruptions." 3 days later, a package arrived at the Steel Demons clubhouse. Inside was a photo of Frank in a hospital bed, holding a tiny baby. The note read, "Frank, Beth, and baby Joey want to thank their guardian angels. The doctors say without Doc's help, Frank wouldn't have made it to meet his grandson. You're welcome at our home anytime. Family isn't always blood." And in the pilot's lounge at Delta's Atlanta hub, James added a new photo to the bulletin board, himself in uniform, standing with 6 leather-clad bikers in front of his aircraft. Beneath it, he wrote, "Never judge a book by its cover. Sometimes the roughest people have the kindest hearts."